In the winter of 1875, 7 years after Timothy Caldwell vanished from the Missouri State Hospital under mysterious circumstances, a string of unsettling deaths began surfacing across 3 Kansas counties. Each victim was elderly or infirm and had recently employed a courteous, intelligent young caregiver who called himself Thomas Whitfield. The disturbing pattern wasn't just the frequency of the deaths, but the clinical precision with which they occurred and the fact that Whitfield always disappeared just before suspicion arose. Dr. Samuel Harding, now a 68-year-old retiree from medical practice, would spend his remaining years pursuing a killer whose methods had evolved far beyond the twisted behaviors Harding had once chronicled in the leather-bound journals of Sedalia County. The boy who had once tortured animals in shadowy caves had become something far more dangerous, a predator who weaponized human kindness. If you haven't yet seen the first part of Timothy Caldwell's chilling story, be sure to watch it to grasp the full scope of the horror that follows. Subscribe to our channel for the full series and share in the comments if you recall where we last left off with the boy who disappeared from the asylum. By 1875, Kansas was still grappling with its identity in the aftermath of the Civil War, and many families moving westward brought elderly or disabled loved ones who needed care. In rural areas where medical help was scarce and expensive traveling caregivers became a lifeline. Among them, none were more sought after than Thomas Whitfield. At just 19, he was articulate, calm, and astonishingly knowledgeable in medicine, for someone with no formal education, claiming he had learned by assisting a country doctor in Missouri. His references were glowing letters from grateful families, praising his gentle demeanor, unwavering dedication, and uncanny ability to comfort the dying. He took on the hardest cases, patients with dementia, war veterans haunted by trauma, and the terminally ill. Unlike others, he didn't shy away from suffering. He charged reasonable fees, stayed just long enough to help, and always seemed to know the exact moment his services were no longer needed. Families appreciated not only his skill, but his honest assessments and the comfort he brought in preparing them for the inevitable. Dr. Benjamin Wheeler, the county physician of Leavenworth County, met Thomas in March 1875 when he submitted the death certificate for an elderly woman named Martha Henley. Her death was expected. She had been slowly fading from consumption, but Thomas's demeanor raised red flags. He was unusually composed for someone who had spent weeks caring for a dying woman and spoke about her final moments with the detached precision of a trained physician. What disturbed Wheeler most was the young man's curiosity about the death certificate itself, how causes of death were determined, what evidence was required, how thorough investigations typically were. Wheeler later wrote that it felt less like curiosity and more like data gathering for some future plan. Still, there was no fault to find. The Henley family praised Thomas's care, describing how he had remained by her side through her final nights, given medication exactly as instructed, and offered constant comfort. Her passing seemed entirely natural. From there, Thomas moved swiftly and methodically from home to home. His next patient was 73-year-old Samuel Morrison, a stroke victim whose son Robert hired Thomas after a glowing recommendation from the Henleys. For 4 weeks, Thomas tended to Samuel with quiet discipline. Neighbors sometimes saw him walking the property at dawn, occasionally carrying medical supplies, other times simply standing alone in the fields. When questioned, he said the morning air helped him stay healthy while caring for demanding patients. Samuel Morrison died on a Tuesday morning in April, allegedly of a second, more severe stroke. Thomas was the one who found him and immediately contacted Dr. Wheeler. Once again, the death seemed consistent with the patient's condition. And once again, the family praised Thomas's foresight. He had warned them just the day before that their father's decline was accelerating. Robert Morrison told Dr. Wheeler that Thomas had warned them about their father's condition. He said the signs of another stroke were present and advised the family to prepare for the worst. When the end came, Thomas managed everything with calm precision. He kept Samuel Morrison comfortable and ensured he wasn't alone in his final moments. Dr. Wheeler's examination found no evidence of foul play. The death aligned with the expected progression of stroke-related complications. Still, Wheeler couldn't ignore how emotionally detached Thomas appeared once again, asking pointed questions about official documentation, investigative procedures, and how such deaths were typically classified. A disturbing pattern was beginning to take shape. Throughout the spring and summer of 1875, every patient under Thomas Whitfield's care died within weeks of his arrival, typically 3 to 5. The timing of each death followed a familiar rhythm, a warning to the family, a brief period of seeming stability, and then a quiet death that occurred while Thomas was conveniently elsewhere in the house or yard. The circumstances always seemed natural. There were no signs of trauma, no irregularities in the body, and the patient was always someone already considered seriously ill. Thomas had chosen his cases with disturbing precision. He took on the patients others avoided, those in clear decline or battling conditions considered terminal. Their families were grateful for his help interpreting the deaths as inevitable, not suspicious. Compounding the deception was Thomas's transient lifestyle. He never stayed in one area long enough to raise alarm. By moving between counties in a calculated loop, he ensured that authorities never had time to connect the string of deaths to his presence. Months, sometimes years passed before he returned to a familiar town. And when he did, no one remembered to be wary. The death that would unravel everything occurred in August of 1875 in the quiet farming town of Oskaloosa, Kansas. Reverend Jonathan Hartwell, 67, had long served the local Baptist congregation. His physician described him as suffering from heart failure, a serious condition, but not one expected to claim his life immediately. After a particularly bad episode left him bedridden, his daughter Elizabeth sought help and hired Thomas Whitfield. As usual, Thomas made a strong impression. He was polite, attentive, and seemed to stabilize the Reverend's condition. In fact, Hartwell began to improve during the first 2 weeks of Thomas's care. But unlike Thomas's past patients, Reverend Hartwell remained mentally sharp. His mind hadn't dulled from illness or age, and he possessed a lifetime of experience reading people decades spent counseling the troubled, comforting the grieving, and discerning hidden pain in others. On the morning of August 15th, Reverend Hartwell summoned Elizabeth to his bedside. She would later recall how disturbed he seemed despite the fact that his physical condition had been improving. He told her something was wrong with Thomas. He had begun asking inappropriate questions about the church, the family's finances, even whether they kept money in the house. But what truly unsettled the Reverend was Thomas's expression. He told Elizabeth that the young man watched him in quiet moments with a cold, analytical stare, not like a caregiver, but like a scientist observing a subject in an experiment. It was the gaze of someone who wasn't offering care, but studying his prey. Reverend Hartwell had sensed something deeply unsettling. He told Elizabeth that Thomas showed no real concern for his well-being, only a cold, detached calculation whenever he thought he wasn't being watched. The most disturbing moments came at night. Several times the Reverend had awoken to find Thomas silently standing by his bedside, not checking his condition or administering medication, but simply watching him sleep with an expression that felt more like curiosity than care. It felt like he was waiting, Elizabeth recalled. Not waiting to help, waiting for something to happen. Her father begged her not to leave him alone with Thomas again, not even for a moment. Elizabeth promised to stay close, though she was torn. She couldn't ignore her father's fear. But it was difficult to reconcile with the respectful, competent young man who had seemed to improve her father's health in just a few weeks. That afternoon, while Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing lunch, her father's voice rang out, not a call for help, but a desperate cry of alarm. She rushed to his room and found Thomas standing over the bed holding a pillow. He claimed he had simply been adjusting it for the Reverend's comfort. Reverend Hartwell was unconscious, but breathing. Thomas calmly explained that the Reverend had suffered a sudden episode, perhaps a mild stroke or a heart incident, and that he had been trying to ease his discomfort when Elizabeth arrived. Dr. Wheeler was called immediately. His examination confirmed that Reverend Hartwell had suffered some form of cardiac distress, but he regained consciousness within hours and stabilized. More importantly, his memory was intact. In private with Thomas out of the room, the Reverend told Dr. Wheeler what really happened. "Someone tried to smother me," he said. "I woke up with that young man pressing a pillow over my face. When I struggled, he pressed harder. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die." It was a horrifying revelation. Reverend Hartwell was a trusted figure in the community. His word carried weight. But Thomas Whitfield's reputation was spotless. He had no obvious motive to harm his patient, and the idea that he would attempt murder in broad daylight with family nearby seemed unthinkable. When confronted, Thomas reacted with the perfect blend of shocked concern and wounded professionalism. He insisted that he had only been helping the Reverend when the incident occurred, and that the elderly man's memory might have been distorted by oxygen deprivation during the cardiac episode. "I understand Reverend Hartwell is confused about what happened." Thomas said, his voice calm and sincere. "I've seen this before. Cardiac events can cause hallucinations or false memories. What matters now is that he's recovering. I want to do everything I can to help." His explanation was medically plausible. His demeanor was flawless. But Dr. Wheeler had felt uneasy about Thomas before, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Quietly, he began to dig deeper. Over the next several days, Wheeler reached out to county officials in neighboring jurisdictions. He requested records, death certificates, and any documentation related to caregivers. The pattern that emerged was chilling. In just under 6 months, Thomas Whitfield had been present at the deaths of 17 individuals across 3 different counties. Taken individually, each death had seemed natural, an expected end for someone elderly or ill. But together the pattern was undeniable. Wherever Thomas went, death followed. What had once seemed like coincidence now pointed towards something far more deliberate and far more terrifying. Dr. Wheeler's growing suspicions found new weight as he uncovered troubling inconsistencies in Thomas Whitfield's past. Several families, it turned out, had quietly reported minor thefts following the deaths of their loved ones. Missing cash heirloom jewelry or other valuables that vanished in the confusion of grief. At the time, these losses had been dismissed as accidents or oversights. But when viewed collectively, they painted a more sinister picture. The most damning discovery came when Wheeler examined Thomas's professional references. The families he claimed to have served in Missouri either didn't exist or had never heard of him. His glowing testimonials were forgeries. His past was fiction. Thomas Whitfield had built his identity on a carefully constructed lie, one that allowed him to embed himself within vulnerable households and disappear before anyone began asking the right questions. As Wheeler expanded his investigation across state lines, he began working with law enforcement in Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado. The pattern was unmistakable. A young male caregiver, unusually skilled in medicine, moved from town to town, accepted only the most fragile patients, and departed just before the inevitable death. The frequency, the strategy, and the eerie silence left behind all pointed toward the same predator. Then came the breakthrough. Wheeler sent a query to Missouri, hoping to identify any young men with medical knowledge who had recently migrated to Kansas. The reply came swiftly in the form of a blunt and urgent telegram from Dr. Samuel Harding. Stop investigating immediately. Stop. Boy from Sedalia. Case. Stop. Extremely dangerous. Stop. Will arrive Kansas soonest. Stop. Harding, now 68 and long retired, had spent the past 7 years chasing shadows, investigating strange isolated deaths scattered across the Midwest, each whispering echoes of a case that had haunted him since 1868. His private records chronicled over 40 suspicious fatalities, all bearing the same signature he had once observed in a disturbed young patient named Timothy Caldwell. But without concrete proof, the case remained a ghost until now. The deaths in Kansas were different. They were clean patterned and concentrated. For the first time in years, Harding saw a clear thread connecting the killings to Timothy. The methodical targeting of the sick and elderly, the manipulative charm, the precise timing, it all fit the behavioral profile he had crafted from his time with the boy in Missouri. 3 days later, Harding arrived in Oskaloosa, armed with his original journals from the Caldwell case and 7 years of notes and correspondence. His first stop was Reverend Hartwell's bedside. The Reverend recounted in careful detail the unnerving behavior of Thomas Whitfield, the cold gaze, the probing questions, the near-fatal encounter with the pillow. Everything Reverend Hartwell described matched Harding's notes on Timothy's early behavior. The detachment, the fascination with pain, the complete absence of empathy. But it was a physical detail that sealed the truth. The Reverend described a small scar on Thomas's left hand, one Harding distinctly remembered from a violent altercation at the Caldwell farm. The boy had received it during their final encounter before escaping the hospital. "It's him," Harding told Wheeler with grim finality. "Timothy Caldwell has been hiding in plain sight. He had grown into a man capable of calculated, organized murder. No longer the impulsive child who tortured animals in rural Missouri. Timothy had become something far more dangerous, a predator who understood how to exploit trust, wield charm, and cloak himself in professionalism. His methods had matured, and so had his motives. Harding believed Timothy was no longer killing solely out of psychological compulsion. The pattern of theft that followed his victims pointed to something colder and more deliberate. He had monetized his crimes. Murder had become both his pathology and his livelihood. "He's found a way to make killing profitable," Harding said. "And that makes him even harder to stop. Let me know if you'd like this continued trimmed for narration or restructured for episode scripting." But money was never Timothy's true motivation. It was merely a means to an end, a tool that allowed him to continue what he considered his real work. From the beginning, Timothy had been obsessed with death, not just the act of dying, but the emotional unraveling that surrounded it. He was fascinated by the way people reacted when death came close, how fear shaped their final hours. Now, with the identity of Thomas Whitfield, he had built a system that gave him unrestricted access to the dying while cloaking himself in legitimacy and trust. Realizing the full scope of what they were dealing with, Dr. Harding and Dr. Wheeler developed a multi-jurisdictional plan to expose Timothy's crimes and bring him to justice. Law enforcement agencies across several states had to be involved, and they had to be ready for anything, including the likelihood that Timothy would flee or worse, lash out violently once he realized he was under scrutiny. Their fears seemed justified when Thomas suddenly announced he would be leaving the Hartwell household. He told Elizabeth that her father's health had stabilized and that another family in a nearby county required his attention. To Harding, it was a familiar script. This was how Timothy always vanished, just before the noose could tighten. But this time, Harding was ready. Working with Sheriff Marcus Thompson of Jefferson County, he arranged surveillance around the Hartwell home and coordinated with law enforcement in neighboring regions to monitor roads, train stations, and telegraph offices. Timothy Caldwell would not simply disappear into the night again. As the surveillance operation unfolded, it revealed just how meticulous Timothy had become. He didn't pack and slip away. Instead, he spent days observing the sheriff's office from multiple vantage points, tracking patrol routes and scouting possible escape trails through the woods and fields. He moved like a chess player, several moves ahead, plotting not just his exit, but his next strategy. More chilling still were his visits to the local cemetery. Officers saw him walking between headstones, taking notes in a small leather journal. Dr. Harding believed he was compiling details on the recently deceased, possibly crafting new identity, or constructing the next fictional caregiver he would become. "He's not running," Harding told Sheriff Thompson. "He's evolving. This is his next hunt. He's already planning who he'll be, where he'll go, and who will die there." Then came the break. One of Thompson's deputies stationed outside town spotted Timothy meeting with a stranger near an abandoned grain mill. The man was later identified as Marcus Sullivan, a known forger and con artist recently released from a Missouri prison. Sullivan specialized in fake documents and false identities, and he had clearly been hired by Timothy to craft the next mask he would wear. Law enforcement moved quickly. Sullivan was arrested shortly after the meeting, and under interrogation, he revealed the scale of what they were dealing with. Timothy hadn't just been recycling the same alias. He had built an entire web of false identities across state lines. At least 6 different names each, with fabricated references, background stories, and forged credentials, had allowed him to move freely and continue his work without suspicion. But it was what Sullivan said next that truly chilled the room. Timothy, he explained, had grown tired of killing one person at a time. He had begun referring to a grand project, a plan to find the ideal family, the ideal environment where he could conduct what he called comprehensive experiments. Sullivan didn't know the exact details, but Timothy had spoken about wanting to be remembered to leave behind something monumental. He was no longer content with solitary murders. He wanted to orchestrate something larger, more horrifying, and disturbingly methodical. Dr. Harding recognized the escalation instantly. Years of isolated killings had been preparation. The individual deaths were experiments. Small tests designed to refine his methods, hide his tracks, and perfect his control over human behavior. Now Timothy was aiming higher. Harding believed he was preparing to target not just a single patient, but an entire household, or worse, a whole community, testing how far he could push his control while maintaining the illusion of natural deaths. Timothy isn't just a murderer, Harding told the assembled law enforcement team. He's a researcher of human suffering. As a boy, he killed to satisfy his curiosity. As a man, he's trying to construct a theory. He wants to see what happens when entire systems fail under the weight of grief and death. The urgency to stop him became critical when Thomas Whitfield failed to depart the Hartwell home as scheduled. Elizabeth reported that he had left early that morning, claiming he had a few errands to run before his official farewell. But nightfall came, and he hadn't returned. The clock had started ticking. Somewhere out there, Timothy Caldwell was already disappearing, and whatever came next would be far worse than anything he had done before. A search of Thomas Whitfield's room confirmed that he had taken most of his belongings. But what he left behind offered investigators chilling insight into the mind of a killer. Hidden beneath the mattress, they discovered a carefully kept journal, dozens of pages documenting his time with various families in meticulous clinical detail. It was more than a record of his movements. It was a blueprint for his crimes. Each entry broke down the family structure, financial standing, emotional vulnerabilities, and psychological pressure points of his patients' households. Timothy had been profiling his victims not just to choose who would die, but to understand how their deaths would affect those left behind. The most disturbing section of the journal outlined what he called the culmination project, a plan to systematically dismantle an entire family over time. It was an experiment in prolonged psychological destruction designed to test the effects of grief, despair, and survival instincts under calculated trauma. The journal triggered an immediate multi-state manhunt. Timothy's notes pointed to Lancaster County, Nebraska, where he had apparently set his sights on the Henderson family, a wealthy but isolated farming household consisting of William Henderson, his wife Margaret, their 3 adult children, and 2 young grandchildren. Timothy had already made contact with them, presenting himself as a caregiver, eager to help with William's declining health. The family's isolation and desperation made them easy targets. They welcomed him without hesitation. Law enforcement acted swiftly. Telegrams were sent to Nebraska, but in 1875, communication moved slower than evil. Dr. Harding, recognizing the urgency, chose to travel to Lancaster County himself. Though age had worn his body, his resolve was unshaken. He blamed himself for the blood already spilled. Timothy's escape from the Missouri State Hospital had been his failure, and the years of horror that followed were in Harding's mind, a consequence of that one moment. "This is mine to finish," he told Sheriff Thompson. "Timothy Caldwell is my responsibility." The journey took 3 days by rail and stagecoach. During that time, Harding pored over every page of his original journals and case notes, searching for anything that could help him anticipate Timothy's next move. What terrified him most was how far the boy had come. The reckless child who once acted on impulse had grown into a calculating predator who could craft identities, manipulate grief, and orchestrate chaos with precision. Then the news he feared most arrived. Timothy, still using the name Thomas Whitfield, had reached the Henderson farm. He was already inside the household. The countdown had begun. Every hour that passed gave Timothy more control, more time to implant fear-fracture bonds and move closer to the destruction he had so carefully planned. Harding arrived on a cold, gray October morning with Sheriff Robert Kane of Lancaster County and 2 armed deputies. From a distance, the Henderson farm appeared peaceful, smoke rising from the chimney livestock in the fields. But Harding's instincts detected something wrong. The farm's dogs were silent. Morning chores appeared neglected. The windows were covered curtains drawn tight against the daylight. Farm families, especially in the fall, welcomed sunlight for warmth and visibility. Closed curtains meant secrecy, or worse. As the sheriff and his deputies closed in on the house, Harding stayed with the horses, close enough to advise, but out of harm's way. Kane approached the front door, weapon drawn, while his men took positions around the property. He knocked firmly. No answer. Yet there were signs of life, faint movement inside the soft creak of floorboards, the steady curl of smoke from the chimney. Someone was home. Someone was listening, and yet no one came to the door. Kane tried the handle. It was unlocked, unusual for an isolated family, especially with a stranger staying under their roof. It meant one of 2 things: either the Hendersons had lost the ability to protect themselves, or Timothy had left it open for them. The house had become a trap, and the hunter was already inside. Sheriff Kane entered the farmhouse with measured caution, his voice firm as he announced his presence. The reply he received froze the blood in every man outside. Faint, trembling a voice from deep within the house calling for help. Then a door slammed somewhere down the hallway, followed by hurried footsteps rushing toward the rear of the building. Kane drew his weapon and pressed forward into the main room, and what he found there was a tableau of orchestrated horror. William Henderson sat tied to a chair near the fireplace. His face sunken, his body bruised and gaunt from what appeared to be days of mistreatment. He was alive, barely. Margaret Henderson lay motionless on a nearby sofa, breathing shallowly, her eyes half-lidded and unresponsive. Drugged. The room around them had been transformed into a grotesque laboratory tables, repurposed into workstations, chairs arranged to allow perfect visibility of different areas of the house. Notebooks and surgical tools were laid out with a scientist's precision. Pinned to the walls were hand-drawn charts and graphs tracking physical degradation, emotional responses, decision-making under stress. Timothy hadn't just taken this family hostage, he had turned them into data points in a cruel and calculated experiment. Despite his broken state, William Henderson managed to whisper fragments of what had occurred. Timothy had kept the family isolated from one another, depriving them of food, water, and any means of comfort or stability. He shifted between care and cruelty, building trust just to destroy it again. He said it was for science, William murmured. Studying how families fall apart, how people choose between themselves and the ones they love. He made us watch. He made us choose. Before Kane could respond, gunshots rang out from the rear of the house. Shouts followed. Timothy Caldwell had attempted to flee through a back window and had encountered the deputies stationed outside. Dr. Harding sprinted toward the noise and reached the farmyard just as Timothy emerged, tall, lean, 19 hands raised in apparent surrender. But Harding saw through the gesture immediately. "Don't trust him," he shouted. "He's planning something." Timothy turned toward the voice and smiled. The same cold, knowing smile he had worn as a boy. It hadn't changed. It never would. "Dr. Samuel Harding," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "I wondered when you'd find me. I hoped you would, actually. There are questions I've been waiting to ask." What followed was not a surrender, but a presentation. Timothy spoke of his years of freedom like a researcher discussing a successful study. He described the precision with which he had refined his methods, the evolution of his psychological strategies, the purity of his data. "You were right about me," he told Harding. "I was never going to feel empathy. But you were wrong about the rest. I'm not broken. I'm evolved. I've removed the weaknesses that limit most people." To Timothy, his victims had never been human. They were subjects, raw material, for what he believed to be the most comprehensive study of death and suffering ever conducted. "The Hendersons," he said with chilling pride, "they're my masterpiece. I've tracked every reaction, every fracture in the family bond. I know what people will sacrifice and what they won't." Dr. Harding, shaken but composed, understood now that Timothy's purpose wasn't to escape, it was to boast, to reveal the scale of his crimes. "I have journals," Timothy continued. 43 documented deaths, psychological profiles, family breakdowns, community reactions. It's the most complete study of mortality ever compiled. Don't you want to know what I've learned? And Harding did. Against every instinct, he felt the pull of knowledge of years of unethical experimentation that had produced insights no academic institution would dare attempt. But he also knew that this was a trap, one last manipulation. Timothy knew Harding's weakness, just as he had always known his victims. "Where are the others?" Harding asked, cutting through the mind games. Timothy's eyes gleamed. "That's part of the experiment. They're alive for now. But whether they stay that way depends on the choices you make next. You have to decide, Dr. Harding. What matters more to you, justice or mercy?" The trap snapped shut. Timothy had arranged a final test, not just for the Hendersons, but for the men trying to stop him. He revealed that each family member had been placed in a different location on the farm, facing a unique time-sensitive death scenario. The eldest son, James, was trapped in the barn's hayloft, rigged to collapse under any careless movement. Mary, the daughter, was locked in the root cellar where a slow gas leak from a broken lantern threatened to suffocate her. The grandchildren had been placed in the well house where the structure had been sabotaged to flood slowly. "You see the beauty of it," Timothy said, eyes bright with madness. "You can't save them all. Not in time. And if you focus on capturing me, they all die. It's a perfect test of decision-making under pressure." Sheriff Kane immediately ordered his men to begin rescue operations. But Timothy had calculated every variable. Each rescue required precision knowledge and time, too much time. Rushing could mean catastrophe. Waiting could mean death. Harding now faced the same excruciating dilemma that Timothy had inflicted on so many others. Do you stop the monster or save his victims? As Harding watched the chaos unfold, he realized that this was Timothy Caldwell's final thesis, an experiment not in killing, but in moral failure. And once again, Timothy was watching, studying, smiling. "This is your final experiment, isn't it?" Dr. Harding asked quietly. "You're not trying to escape. You're trying to make a point about human nature." Timothy nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "I knew you'd understand eventually. Yes, this is my culminating study. I want to observe how society responds when it's forced to choose between justice and mercy, punishment, and the prevention of suffering. The Hendersons have been ideal test subjects. But you, Dr. Harding, you are the real variable, the one that matters most." "And after this?" Harding asked. "What happens once your experiment ends?" Timothy's tone remained clinical, almost curious. "That depends on the data. If the results are satisfactory, I'll move on. I've been considering broader research, community-wide stress testing. Entire towns placed under controlled duress. Can you imagine what we could learn from that?" The implications were horrifying. Timothy hadn't just been fantasizing about escalating his violence. He had already begun laying the intellectual groundwork to expand his methods beyond families and into communities. But amid the confidence, Harding saw something else, a hunger for approval. Timothy wasn't just executing a final study. He was seeking validation from the one man whose opinion still mattered to him. "You've done remarkable work," Harding said carefully. "But it's incomplete. You've studied pain, death, despair. But you've never studied healing. You've never tried to understand redemption or recovery. There's more to the human experience than what you've observed." For the first time, Timothy's expression faltered. "Redemption is a lie told by weak people who can't accept reality," he snapped. But his voice carried a subtle note of doubt. Harding pressed the opening. "Is it you've spent years running from consequences? But if you were truly as evolved as you claim, you'd confront them. You'd accept responsibility for the world you've shattered." The gamble was immense. Harding was risking everything. His safety, the lives of the Hendersons, the fragile stability of the moment, on the belief that Timothy's need to be seen and understood outweighed his need to control. And slowly, it began to work. The facade of invulnerability cracked. "You think I chose this?" Timothy said, his voice finally breaking. "You think I wanted to be this way? I've tried to feel what others feel. I've tried to understand why love, grief, loyalty matter. But they don't. Not to me. They never did. Something's missing, and I don't know why." In that moment, the monster stripped away his mask, and what remained was a fractured, brilliant, hollow young man. For the first time in years, Timothy Caldwell wasn't orchestrating horror. He was admitting the terror inside himself. As Timothy spiraled into his emotional breakdown, Sheriff Kane's deputies completed their rescue efforts. Each member of the Henderson family was saved, though some were injured, and all bore the trauma of Timothy's experiment. When Harding told Timothy they were safe, the young man didn't lash out. He didn't fight. He simply nodded. "I'm glad," he whispered. I didn't want them to die. I just wanted to understand. I just wanted to know what makes people care. The arrest of Timothy Caldwell stunned the Midwest. His crimes spanned 3 states, over 40 deaths, and a criminal methodology so advanced it would shape psychological profiling for decades. Yet his youth and the complexity of his mental state made prosecution a legal minefield. Many of his murders had occurred while he was still technically a minor. Others blurred the line between premeditation and psychological compulsion. Dr. Harding's exhaustive testimony shaped the future of forensic psychiatry. He detailed Timothy's development from a disturbed moi into a calculated killer, presenting a case study that would influence legal definitions of antisocial personality disorder for generations. Harding's work helped establish precedents for how such cases would be evaluated, prosecuted, and treated. In the courtroom, Timothy was disturbingly cooperative. He testified with characteristic detachment, recounting each murder as if reviewing data points. He offered no apologies, but his descriptions of method and motive provided rare and chilling insight into the mind of a predator who viewed human beings as test subjects. The final verdict was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Due to his psychological significance and the danger he posed, Timothy was transferred to a secure facility specially designed for long-term psychiatric incarceration, equal parts prison and research institution. Dr. Harding visited Timothy regularly during the first year of his imprisonment. Their sessions were formal, recorded, and published in academic journals. The interviews became foundational to modern understanding of psychopathy. Timothy remained as brilliant and dangerous as ever, cold, manipulative, and without remorse, but his need for intellectual connection made him a uniquely valuable subject. He never expressed regret for his crimes, but he remained obsessed with one question: why do people love each other? In the end, even the most terrifying predator was haunted by the one human truth he could never comprehend. He represents something medical science is only beginning to understand, Dr. Samuel Harding wrote in his final report. Timothy Caldwell is not evil in the supernatural sense. He is the product of a rare neurological condition, intelligence without empathy, curiosity without conscience. If we can understand individuals like Timothy, we might one day prevent future tragedies before they begin. The Henderson family survived, though the trauma left scars that would never fully heal. William Henderson became a staunch advocate for reform, working with law enforcement to create stricter protocols for caregiver verification, hoping that no other family would suffer the same deception. Meanwhile, Timothy Caldwell's meticulously kept journals chronicling his methods, observations, and psychological experiments became invaluable to researchers. Law enforcement solved multiple cold cases using patterns he had documented, and his writings laid a disturbing foundation for the study of serial killers and manipulative psychopaths. Yet, the most profound legacy came from Dr. Harding's research. The Caldwell case revolutionized the field of child psychology, introducing new screening tools for identifying antisocial behavior early in life. It challenged the legal system, forcing new frameworks for dealing with youthful offenders whose crimes reflected mature, complex pathology. For all its horror, the case became a turning point in modern criminal psychology. Timothy adapted to prison as easily as he had adapted to every other environment. He manipulated guards with charm, earned privileges through apparent compliance, and used his incarceration as yet another laboratory. "I've learned so much here," he told Dr. Harding in 1876 during their final meeting. Prison is the ideal research environment. The subjects are already categorized by their psychological failings. All I have to do is observe. When asked if he felt remorse, his answer was brutally honest. "I understand intellectually that my actions caused pain. I understand society condemns that pain. But I don't feel it, not the way others seem to. I can mimic remorse if I need to, but I don't experience it. That candor ensured he would never be released, but it made him one of the most studied criminals in American history. Dr. Harding died in 1877, a year after Timothy's conviction. His final journal entry, penned just days before his death, reflected the weight of a lifetime spent trying to understand the unthinkable. Timothy Caldwell is not merely a killer. He is a mirror held to the darkest corners of the human mind. To know him is to acknowledge that evil may not always wear the face of rage or hatred, but the calm, clinical gaze of a curious child who never learned to care. I have devoted my final years to stopping him. And in doing so, I have learned more about the nature of evil than I ever did in 4 decades of medicine. Timothy Caldwell remained imprisoned until his death in 1923 at the age of 67. He never stopped writing. Over 47 years, he developed increasingly complex theories about criminal behavior, power structures, and emotional manipulation. His writings became core reading for early FBI profilers and forensic psychologists. Yet despite all the analysis, one truth remained. Timothy never changed. In his final interview months before he died, he was asked if he had any regrets. Only that I lacked access to proper laboratories and more sophisticated subjects, he said. I did what I could with the tools I had, but in a more advanced era, I believe my work could have redefined our understanding of human psychology. Even in death, Timothy Caldwell saw himself not as a murderer, but as a researcher denied opportunity. The complete absence of remorse, the utter inability to comprehend love, grief or guilt remained the clearest evidence of his condition. His life, crimes, and writings continue to challenge our understanding of morality, justice, and the terrifying capacity for evil that can exist behind a gentle smile and polite voice. The Caldwell case remains a landmark in American criminal psychology, a cautionary tale about what happens when brilliance grows in the absence of empathy. It established legal and scientific precedents that still shape how we understand sociopathy and psychopathy today. But the questions it raised remain unanswered. Was Timothy Caldwell born without a conscience? Or was he made that way, shaped by childhood trauma, neglect, or some combination of both? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could there be others like him, hiding in plain sight? Charming, intelligent, helpful, until it's too late. What do you think drove Timothy Caldwell to become what he did? Was he a genetic aberration or a creation of circumstance, and in a world still struggling to understand the human mind? How many more might walk among us? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true tales from America's darkest past. The story of Timothy Caldwell may be over, but the shadow he cast still lingers.